Hey all, so Jason, I'm with the support operations team. I'm the support operations manager, and I kind of wanted to go over what the ticket round robin looks like, especially with the new counter system we're building that will be going live tomorrow or Monday, which you won't see any changes, but it'll help more numerically balance the load of tickets going to each global group. I'll kind of go a little bit towards the end into how it used to work and why we're moving to the new one, but let me share my screen. We'll kind of start going over the code. Cool. So this is kind of the README file. It will contain like the recording link. It'll talk very, very briefly on the counter system and special tickets and what the groups are and how to add a new one and all that fun stuff. Not as obvious without looking at the code for some of that, which is why we're doing this recording. So gem file wise, what this Ruby script is using is the Faraday middleware, JSON, and OJ. Faraday is used for making basically curl-like connections. It's for making external calls. JSON because it's going to be parsing a JSON file and working with a JSON file. And then OJ is a gem I like to use when making HTTP requests. It takes the response body and turns it into a Ruby object for me that I can start manipulating. It's a lot easier than taking what is most of the time a giant string and trying to work with it. So that basically kind of parses it into that format for me. Right now it's using 3.0.1, but probably tell with these gems that I'm using, there's no reason it's on that specific Ruby version. That just right now is what Ops is using globally for most of our projects. So kind of go with that. We got a Ruby comp file here to kind of tweak some of the linting settings that it does. One linting thing that's common in Ruby is any digit that's over 3 should be using underscores where you would normally use a comma in human readable English. I dislike that. I think it makes scripts look really weird and it makes it difficult for me to read. So I always turn that off when I'm dealing with numbers like that. And then ABC size and method length. I have some more complex functions in there that couldn't be simplified down, and those were the only things there, so I kind of limited them. The method length is mostly because I'll occasionally set objects as functions, and super annoying when, yes, I get that it shouldn't be more than 10, but this particular JSON object has 11 lines. And then our CI file, which is how all this runs, is basically just calling the run script, and it runs on a schedule. For my before script, I always do ruby-v. By doing debugging, it's real easy to look at a CI job and say, okay, yeah, it's on 3.1 like it should be, or 3.0.1. I always install bundler, and then I just run bundle. And because of the gem file, it'll do all that for me. The run script is not very fancy. It's requiring the actual scripts and then just calling the ticket round robin Zendesk class and then telling it to run. Data-wise, we have a counter.json, which right now is all zeroed, but once this goes live, will never be zeroed again. It'll pretty much just keep iterating. We'll go over that a bit more as I go over the scripts. And then we have a code owners file, which is used for our actual project for MR approvals and stuff like that. So the actual script starts with this ticket round robin.rb. This is where I'm declaring the module initially. I'm doing some fancy Rubying here to shortcut having to require all those gems. I only have 3, so really not saving myself that much time. But when you get to gems that are using hundreds of script setups that are using hundreds of gems, it's a great shortcut that basically says, if I installed the gem during bundle, I'm going to need it. And for various gems, there are special ways you have to put them in the gem file to require them the right way, but we're dealing with some very basic ones here, so not a big deal. And then it's going to call require relative, which is telling it to require a relative file. In this case, it's going to be in the ticket round robin folder, and it's called client. So ticket round robin folder, and then client. This within that module is where I declare a class. The first thing I do is require the Zendesk file, but we'll go over that in a bit. Here in the client file, I'm just kind of declaring some functions I'm going to be using. In more complex scripts, I like to use this method because I will often call like the GitLab client in several different files, and I don't want to redefine that client every time. But essentially, I'm making a new Faraday connection to the GitLab API. I'm setting that the request is URL encoded. I'm setting the adapter to whatever the default Faraday adapter is, which works for me. Sometimes you want to use a specialized Faraday adapter. I don't really need to. I'm basically doing curl commands on this. And then because I'm talking to the GitLab API, I'm setting the private token header to an environment variable, and that environment variable will be the GL token. Environment.fetch is the new way that they want you to be using environment variables in Ruby scripting. It used to just be environment square bracket, like you were calling an array, but now you're supposed to do .fetch. A unique thing you can do there is this, which will say fetch that GL token from your environment, but if it's not there, set it to nil. In this case, this script, I want it to fail if there's not a GitLab token. Like that, there's many problems occurring if it's missing all its environment anyway. Here, I'm just kind of calling something to make it easier for me to commit to a project. Basically, I'm using this client, this Faraday connection we made. I'm making a public send, which is a function to send a request. I'm sending a post request, and then I'm doing it to a specific project. This is where the round robin lives, and what it's doing is this will be used to commit that counter when it updates it. And then ops, we defined, it'll be passed in ops. Yeah, right, it's passed later on in the script. So it'll be passed what the options are, which will basically contain the JSON for the actual commit. I've got a function here to define retry options because typing all that out if I need it multiple times is annoying and not efficient. I'll kind of skip over that, but it's basically just a bunch of settings that are thrown into the request to tell it how to handle various types of failures, such as I failed to connect, I timed out. Tell it try again with this interval, this randomness, back off if you hit the same error this many times, etc. Here I'm using Faraday to create a Zendesk API connection. In this case, I do it with these environment variables because we have the global Zendesk, the US federal, and then both of them have a sandbox. So really annoying to type that URL out and then have to change it constantly. So it's much easier to set an environment variable and just kind of swap that when I'm running scripts locally. When it runs in CI/CD, it has a set variable. This is where those retry options come into play. Once again, default Faraday adapter. Zendesk's API requires you set the content type to application JSON. I don't know why. Everything they reply back to is in JSON. That just feels like a weird arbitrary thing to have to do, but it will fail if you don't. And then I'm creating a basic auth because they don't use like a token thing unless you're using like an OAuth application. So in this case, I am calling the username that's going to be authenticating /token, and then I'm using the Zendesk API token. Here I'm making a function called request, which will basically use this Faraday connection we made for Zendesk and do another public send. But this one I'm making a little more ambiguous so I can call different forms of it. In this case, the HTTP method, so get, post, delete, put, probably another that I'm forgetting off the top of my head. And then it gives it the URL, which will essentially be the API URL. So you can see how here when I did the GitLab one, I didn't have to tell it gitlab.com/API v4. I could just start immediately with the new part of it. This works the same way. And then whatever parameters we're passing in. And then this one I'm using OJ to actually load that response body so that I have a Ruby object to work with, or a structured Ruby object is the way I should say that, because everything in Ruby is an object. For here, I have a function called counter, which literally is just using JSON to read that counter.json file we keep in the data folder. And then here I define our global groups. So right now, we have Baobab, Ginkgo, Kapok, Maple, and Pine. Hoping I pronounced all those right. If we needed to add some, remove some, we wanted to test not routing every third ticket to, not applicable or something like that, we would use this kind of logic. So the real meat and potatoes of this comes from this Zendesk script, which the run function is just calling 3 other functions: sort, assign, and commit. It kind of starts by setting an empty tickets array. This special thing I'm doing here, which you might have seen in some of the other functions, I'm making tickets callable by @tickets once it's initiated. But this right here, the double pipe equal, is a Ruby method of saying set it to this, but only if it has no value. This is super useful so that I can call tickets once and it's an empty array. That's what I needed. And then I can just push to it without having to have defined it per function or anything weird like that. So it allows me to just say tickets, and tickets will keep growing as I add to it. For this, we've got sauce, self-managed, and special, and I abbreviate where I can, but sauce tickets is making requests, which you'll remember from here is a Zendesk request, and it's calling a specific view. This view ID is something only ops can see, but it is a very aptly named sauce to be sorted. And it literally is just taking every new sauce ticket that comes in, which would be, sauce and sauce account, and throwing them into that view, which is filtered based on they have no global group and they're not set to not applicable. And it's essentially just giving me an array of, okay, here's all the sauce tickets to sort. Self-managed is doing the same thing, different view, which just has the self-managed tickets, which would be self-managed, GitLab dedicated, open partner, select partner, alliance partner. And it's just getting an array of those tickets too. So starting out, we've got basically two arrays there. Special tickets, which is a thing we're not currently using, but it might be used in the future. So this is kind of unused code right now, but it could be used. Basically, it's going to first go through, it's going to kind of, I'm actually not even sure why I'm doing that, because that's kind of okay, now I see what I'm doing. So I've got an objects variable there, which probably not the best name for it, but that's what I just called it. And I'm kind of initiating initiating this hash with basically the last part of the group. So if we go back to the groups, it's splitting on underscore and it's getting the last. So it's basically just going to get, these four right here, or these five, sorry. So it's going to get each of those just as a string by itself and kind of initiate this object. So it's basically doing like Baobab is an empty array, Pine is an empty array, which I could have done there in the objects, but I tried to prevent hard coding actual group names. That way, if we add a new one, we don't have to do that many script changes. It's just, go add them in that one array in the client. So from there, I'm making an array of I'm making an array containing two different arrays, the sauce and the self-managed tickets. And I'm going through each list. On each list, I'm then iterating through each group. And essentially, I'm looking for that ticket to contain that group's organizational SGT tag, which, again, would just be the name of it. If it contains that, it's going to sort it into a special ticket object, which is keeping it away from the rest of them. The idea here is, let's say, Jason's awesome org. Every ticket from that they file goes to Pine. They would have that Pine tag in their org level. And then when they file tickets, they would have a Pine tag, and that would tell this script, hey, every one of their tickets goes to the Pine group. Do not send it to other groups. We have this remove thing, which will then go back over these sauce and self-managed tickets to remove them from those objects if they're a special ticket. The idea here is we could specialize, route these tickets if desired. Again, none of this is currently in use. It's something that is being toyed with. So I wanted to make sure the script could support it when and if we decided to do that. So once it's kind of done all of this, which you can tell how like remove special tickets is where it starts, and that's going to automatically call special tickets. So it's going to run all of this. That calls sauce and self-managed. So it's calling these up here. But essentially, after it's doing that, it's then going to go through and sort these tickets. And each one's going to kind of use the same method. I probably should have made this a little cleaner and not had three functions to essentially do the same thing. But what I'm basically doing here is referring back to this counter JSON that we started with. And it is sorting them based on these counts of tickets that have been assigned to them. So starting out, obviously, everything's 0. And that's just for this going live. Like I said, once it goes live, they'll never be at 0 again. Unless for some reason we decide to zero them all out, and then we could, and it'll kind of start back over. But essentially what it's going to start by doing is sorting them out. And the way it's kind of doing this, I'll just use the sauce one because it's a little easier to read. It's finding who has the lowest number of tickets first and sorting by that. So in this particular case, well, they're all tied, so it's just going to go by their regular order. So, the order they're in. But in a situation where like everybody had 4, but Baobab had 0, it would say, okay, well, Baobab has 0. So in this particular case, it would say, okay, well, they get this first ticket. And then it's going to add that they've gotten a, sauce ticket. So it's going to up their count by 1. And then it's going to repeat this iteration in this grouping every time. So every time it's going to say who has the least, okay, they get the next one. Who has the least, they have the next one. So it's going to distribute these numerically in a balanced way. I say numerically because obviously ticket's not a ticket. One ticket could be harder than the other, but there's no real great way to calculate that looking at a brand new ticket. There could be a system we build in the future where we build like weights based on categorization or something along those lines, at which point the counter system would be not adding 1, but adding a weight, and they would determine by that. But right now, a ticket is a ticket as far as this counter is assumed. So it's just kind of throwing one sauce to one sauce, one SM to one SM. But essentially, it's going through all of this. And while it's doing it, it is creating what we call an update object, which I'll go down here to show. Super fancy, but this is what it's going to be passing to Zendesk. The ticket ID is this, and then we're editing this particular custom field, which it has an ID of this, and we're setting the group to that SGG. That custom field is what you will see on a ticket called SGG, because I'm not that original on naming. So basically, this is just setting the SGG for all of these. But it's making this giant kind of array of, here's all the tickets you need to update. You see how it's pushing to that empty tickets array we had each time it runs for these, to essentially give it a giant array of, here's all your updates you need to make. From there, it actually calls the assigned groups is what we were running. So, assigned groups is doing all these. There it is. Sorry. Assigned groups is what it would do next. So after it's sorted and figured out where every ticket's going, assigned groups is going to make a Zendesk request using a put method, and it's going to be a tickets update mini, which is a nice little wrapper that allows me to update 100 tickets, up to 100 tickets at a time with one API call instead of calling 100 API calls. In theory, if we ever got such a giant flood of tickets that we had more than 100 to update, this actually would have an issue and would throw an error. But being that this is set to run about every 10 minutes, we have bigger concerns at that point. At that point, we would have much bigger concerns. Hey, we just had more than 100 tickets created in a 10-minute span. Something's very, very wrong. But essentially, it's going to do this update call unless there's no tickets to sort. That's I obviously don't need to tell it to update 0 tickets. That's just a wasted API call. No point in that. And then just for debug purposes, it tells me what the job ID is. So I can go check CI/CD logs, grab that job ID, and go check in Zendesk's API to see if there was a problem with that job. Tends to be pretty easy to notice, though, when the sorted queues are not in the single digits like they historically are. If they're suddenly in double digits, I start looking for problems. But we have not had that problem, really. We've not had that problem at all, I should say. Yeah, so I'll stop sharing because that's basically the code and how it's going to be working when we implement this counter system. So before I kind of go into the why we're moving to this and what the old one did, any questions, any thoughts? All right, cool. So the current method, what it's currently doing is using what we call the last used method. Based on the index of the SGG in that array of groups, it is committing a number to the repo to say Baobab was used last, Ginkgo was used last, and then it's saying, okay, well, the used last index was 2, so I need to start at 3, and that's how it's currently doing. That works mostly fine. I say mostly fine because if a ticket gets deleted, if stuff like that, it's not really counting it. It technically balances it the same way, with the caveat of if the script were to screw up and throw Baobab 5 tickets, it's going to say Baobab got. It's just saying, as far as the current last use method is concerned, that's 1. They just consider that they got 1. Next is Ginkgo, I think, alphabetically. Whereas this counter system is saying, well, I just threw Baobab 5 tickets. that's 5 tickets they got, not they were just used last. They got 5. You can see how with like the special routing system that this script has in it that we're not using, but could potentially use, that could quickly get to be an unfair balancing. If every ticket's going to Baobab for like 5 organizations, and they're getting routed normal tickets on top of that, it's very quickly going to spiral to where, yeah, no, that one group is getting way more than the rest. It's not balanced. With the last use system, there isn't a way to do any form of specialized routing like that. It's always just going to see them as that's who was used last. Doesn't care how many they got. It only cares about they were used last. So the counter system will allow us to at least kind of keep that in check of saying, well, Pine got 5, everybody else got 1. So Pine is ahead, everybody else has a deficit of 4 that we need to make up before we throw another regular ticket to Pine. And of course, in a flood of ticket situation, yeah, it could get unbalanced, but with the counter system, it will balance itself back out, whereas the last used would never balance back out. Once there's a deficit, it will always just keep making more of a deficit. So we kind of I've been looking at it going, I get my logic, but it was kind of bad. I could see where a situation can occur. So we've been moving to a counter system. I've gotten questions of, could we do specialized routing? And I said, theoretically. And as I was moving to the counter system, I said, I should theoretically put the code in there so that we are not a blocker if support wants to move forward with that. So that's why it's there. It will be unused until support decides otherwise to use it. Cool. Anybody, questions, thoughts, comments, ideas, things you want to kind of express? Cool. So yeah, I'll get this kind of closed up, put onto YouTube, and put into the README for this counter system. And then when that's live, there will be a README with a recording in case you forget any of this or just want to hear my lovely voice go over Ruby coding again for whatever reason. Right on. Well, I appreciate y'all joining. I hope this was educational and helpful to learning how this system works. I know there's been a lot of confusion of, well, how does it work? And I'm like, well, we have this script, and people are like, that's great, but how does it work? And I kind of tried typing up a couple different drafts to explain it. And I was like, I'm typing up to explain how code works after having already coded it, and I'm doing it as a coder. So I'm staring at code going, well, yeah, no, it runs this function. That means nothing to somebody who's not understanding the code. So I felt like this was kind of a better medium to go over all that.
Yeah, was very interesting. Thanks for doing it.
Oh yeah, anytime. More than happy to do that. Well, awesome. I appreciate you all showing, and have a good rest of your day, week, month, night, morning, whatever it may be, wherever you are.
Take care.